She was 19 years old. She had just finished her first year teaching second grade at the parish schoolhouse, and she still carried a piece of chalk in her purse, out of habit. On the night of October 3rd, 1965, Camille Broussard left a church social an hour after dark. Told her friends she'd walk the half-mile home along the Bayou Road like she always did, and never made it there. That is not a story about a school teacher who took a shortcut in the dark. That is a story about a man who danced with her at that very social, walked half the town home in the same direction, and spent the next 59 years standing beside her family at every single memorial mass. And it would take a retired detective who never stopped driving that Bayou Road on his days off, a Dina lab that didn't exist when Camille was born, and a single button torn from a shirt to finally expose him. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back to that October night. Because to understand what Pelican Bend lost, you first have to understand who Camille Broussard was. Pelican Bend, Louisiana, in 1965, was a small bayou parish town where Cajun French still slipped into half the conversations on Main Street, and everyone's front porch faced the water the same way everyone's Sunday faced the church. The air in October carried the smell of drying cane and diesel from the shrimp boats docked along the bayou, thick and sweet in a way that clung to your clothes long after you'd left the water's edge. It was a town of one blinking traffic light, a Catholic church with a bell you could hear from 3 parishes over, and porch radios that played Zydeco on Saturday nights loud enough to draw half the neighborhood outside to dance in the yard. Pelican Bend didn't lock its doors. It didn't need to. Everybody in 3 parishes knew Camille Broussard's name before they knew her family's boat business. Camille was the third of 5 children, the one who'd left for teachers' college in Lafayette and come straight back the moment she graduated, because she couldn't imagine teaching anywhere but the same one-room turned 2-room schoolhouse she herself had learned her letters in. She had a habit of humming old Cajun waltzes under her breath while she graded papers, without ever noticing she was doing it. Her father, Etienne, ran a small shrimping operation out of the bayou, 3 boats deep, and every man on those boats called him boss out of respect, rather than obligation. Her mother, Odalie, kept a garden of okra and peppers that fed half the extended family through the summer, and had taught every one of her children to sew a hem before they turned 10. Camille kept a piece of chalk in her purse at all times, a habit that started the day she got her first classroom and never left her, and she checked, without fail, that her bedroom window latch was secure before bed, not from fear, but because a bat had gotten into her room once as a child, and she'd never quite forgiven the species. Pelican Bend in 1965 did not believe harm came from inside its own fences. That belief held the whole parish together, the unlocked doors, the girls who walked bayou roads alone after dark without a second thought. The way anyone driving a car nobody recognized got noticed and talked about at the general store before they'd gone 3 blocks. Nobody in Pelican Bend that October had any reason to think that belief was wrong. That was the last month anyone in the Broussard family would believe it either. At 8:40 that night, Camille told her friends at the church social she was walking home the way she always did, along the bayou road past the Guidry place. No more than a half-mile in the dark, she knew by heart. At 8:45, several people at the social watched her go, waving from the church steps. That was the last time anyone outside her family saw her whole. By 9:30, Odile grew uneasy. Camille was never later than 9 coming home from a social. By 10:00, Etienne walked the bayou road himself with a lantern, calling her name into cypress trees that gave nothing back but frog song. By 10:45, half the men from the church social had joined him, spreading out along both sides of the bayou road with flashlights and lanterns. At 11:20 p.m., a searcher found one of Camille's shoes caught in the reeds at the water's edge, 30 yards off the road. Her purse was found 10 feet further, chalk still inside it, clasp still closed. No Camille. The parish sheriff arrived by midnight. By 1 a.m., nearly the whole town was combing the bayou bank in a line, lanterns bobbing over black water, calling her name into a night that swallowed every sound whole. Etienne Broussard didn't stop searching that bayou for 9 straight days. He slept maybe 2 hours a night. Nobody found so much as a footprint that told them anything useful. One detail didn't get much attention that first week, and it would sit quietly in an evidence envelope for the next 5 decades. A single shirt button, found caught in the same reeds as Camille's shoe, plain bone, the kind sold in every dry goods store in the parish. Deputies bagged it out of habit, more than expectation. Nobody in 1965 could do anything meaningful with a single button. It went into a file box and stayed there. Detective Ray Fontenot caught the case that week, 7 years into the job and, by his own later admission, entirely unprepared for something this senseless in a town this small. He was the kind of investigator who kept every open case's photograph taped inside his desk drawer, so it was the first thing he saw every single morning before anything else. For Camille Broussard, that photograph stayed taped there for the rest of his career. 2 threads ran side by side that fall. Officially, Fontenot and 2 parish deputies canvassed every household along the Bayou Road, questioned every man who'd been anywhere near that church social, and chased a lead on a stranger's truck seen parked near the water earlier that week. Fontenot's own notes from that first month describe a parish desperate to help, and with almost nothing solid to offer. Half the leads that came in were men who'd simply been out on the bayou that night for reasons that had nothing to do with Camille at all. One name did surface hard and fast. A young shrimp boat deckhand who'd asked Camille to dance twice that night and been turned down both times, and who left the parish entirely less than 2 weeks later. On paper, it looked almost too clean. A public rejection, a hasty departure, a reason to have been lingering near that road in the dark. Fontenot chased him for the better part of a year, tracked him to a fishing job near Morgan City, and cleared him completely. 3 men on that boat placed him working through the night Camille disappeared, their time cards matching down to the hour. It was Pelican Ben's first dead end, and it cost the investigation nearly a full year of momentum. Fontenot would say, years later, that clearing that deckhand felt worse than finding nothing at all, because it meant whoever had taken Camille hadn't been a stranger with a grudge passing through. He wasn't ready to sit with that thought yet, not for a long while. By the winter of 1965, the search had scaled down to occasional tips that led nowhere, and a couple of letters from self-proclaimed psychics whose visions never matched a single detail investigators had on the ground. The physical evidence sat in one thin folder at the parish courthouse. The button, a partial boot print near the water that never matched anyone questioned, a torn scrap of fabric that could have come from almost anyone's Sunday clothes. Fontenot kept driving that bayou road on his own weekends anyway, long after the official search had wound down, stopping to ask questions that had already been asked twice before. Personally, Etienne and Odile Broussard kept living in a house with a bedroom neither of them could bring themselves to touch. Camille's grading pen stayed on her desk exactly where she'd left it, ink dried solid in the barrel. Her Sunday shoes stayed by the front door for years, waiting for a foot that never came home to fill them again. Odile stopped attending the parish fall festival after 1966. Camille had loved that festival, had run the cakewalk table there every year since she was a teenager, and Odile couldn't stand in that crowd without searching every face in it for her daughters. The institutional failure that would follow Fontenot for the rest of his life was a simple one. In 1965, nobody seriously considered a man Camille already knew and trusted from around town. Investigators' files from that fall show they questioned strangers, deckhands passing through, men with grudges, but not the neighbors who'd walked that same search line at midnight with lanterns in hand, calling her name as loud as anyone. Why would you suspect the man who organized half the search parties himself? The parish rallied for months and then, as small towns do, slowly went back to its rhythms. Boats went back out on the bayou. School reopened that Monday with a substitute in Camille's classroom. Pelican Bend never stopped being Pelican Bend for anyone except the Broussards. By 1970, 5 years had passed, and the lantern searches were a memory kept alive only in the parish paper's old clippings. The missing person notice tacked to the general store's front window had faded to something barely legible in the humidity. But nobody ever took it down. Families moved into the house 2 doors from the Broussards twice over those first 5 years, and each set of new neighbors learned, gently and quickly, not to ask about the school teacher whose photograph still hung in the schoolhouse hallway, a fixture the school never once considered taking down. By 1978, Etienne Broussard had aged in a way that had nothing to do with the calendar. He sold 2 of his 3 shrimp boats, couldn't stand being out on that water as long as he used to, not with the Bayou Road always in view from the channel. But he never left Pelican Bend, in case Camille ever came looking for home. That same year, the parish widened the Bayou Road itself, and Fontenot drove out personally to walk the reeds one more time, before the construction crews arrived, just in case there was anything left in that water to find. By 1986, Camille's younger siblings had children of their own, kids who knew an aunt only through a single photograph in the family hallway. A young woman frozen forever at 19 in a floral dress, while their own parents grayed around her. Every one of those grandchildren grew up understanding, without ever quite being told why, that nobody in the family walked the Bayou Road after dark. Detective Ray Fontenot retired in 1994. He did not stop working Camille's case. He kept the file, grown by then to 3 cardboard boxes, in his own garage, and whenever a new forensic technique made the news, he drove it to the state crime lab in New Orleans himself and asked them to try again. In 1999, he requested the first DNA testing ever attempted on that shirt button and the fabric scrap. The samples were too degraded for the technology of that era to produce anything usable. He filed the results and kept waiting. Odile Broussard died in 2012, Camille's grading pen still sitting on that same desk, ink long fossilized in the barrel. Etienne kept it there after her, dusting around it but never once moving it. Every October 3rd, without fail, he walked the Bayou Road himself, stood near the reeds where the shoe had been found, and stayed until the frogs started up at dusk. Lucien Guidry, who still lived on the family land the road was named for, and had walked that same search line himself back in 1965, was often one of the people who saw Etienne out there. And every year, without fail, he was the one who came out to walk beside him a while, offering a quiet word of sympathy, as if he were simply an old neighbor rather than the reason Etienne was standing there at all. The parish moved on around Etienne. He never did. Every case on this channel represents weeks of digging through records, verifying facts, and piecing together real lives that were lost. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind stories like this one, please take a second to like this video, subscribe, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Your support is what makes this possible. Now, let's get back to Camille. Then, in 2024, something happened that no one in Pelican Bend had dared to expect. It would take a forensic extraction technique built for samples decades older than anyone thought testable, and a genealogy database designed for people hunting their own family trees to break open a case even the Broussards had quietly stopped believing would ever resolve. On a Wednesday afternoon in January, a forensic analyst at the State Crime Lab in New Orleans, was running the old shirt button through a new DINA recovery process, meant specifically for degraded, decades-old evidence, when a usable profile finally emerged where 2 earlier attempts had failed completely. She cross-referenced it against a public ancestry database. The process works the same way anyone might trace their own family tree. Crime scene DINA gets uploaded and compared against genetic profiles that ordinary people have voluntarily submitted while researching their own ancestry. And investigators build outward from any distant relative match until the branches narrow down to a single person. A distant cousin match flagged on her screen. She read the name twice, then called the numbers still on file for Ray Fontenot, retired 30 years, because she knew from the case notes that he'd want to hear it before anyone else did. Fontenot later said he sat on his back porch with the phone in his hand for a long minute before he trusted his own voice. He drove the 3 boxes of files to the parish courthouse himself that same week, the way he'd done for nearly 3 decades, except this time he let himself believe it might finally matter. The genealogy team spent the following weeks tracing that single distant match through a family tree rooted entirely in Pelican Bend and the surrounding parish, ruling out cousin after cousin, until the DINA pointed to one family that had fished that same bayou for generations. And one branch of it led straight to a name nobody in that town had ever once considered: Lucien Guidry. The very man whose family land the Bayou Road ran alongside. The man who had danced with Camille at that church social in 1965, who had walked half the searchline himself that October, who had stood beside Etienne Broussard at nearly every single anniversary walk for close to 60 years, offering quiet words of comfort. Lucien Guidry had never been seriously questioned in 1965. He wasn't a stranger, wasn't a scorned deckhand, wasn't anyone investigators had reason to look at twice. He'd spent the next 5 decades as one of the most familiar, trusted faces in Pelican Bend. First, understand how normal he seemed. Guidry ran a small trapping and fishing operation on his family's land his whole life. He served on the church fundraising committee for over 30 years. He was the man half the parish called first if a pirogue needed patching, or a trot line needed running while someone was sick. For nearly 6 decades, Lucien Guidry was, by every visible measure, one of the most decent men in Pelican Bend. Second, the small things that only made sense in hindsight. Neighbors who recalled, only when finally asked directly, that Guidry had burned a pile of his own clothes behind his house that same October week in 1965. Telling anyone who asked it was just old work clothes not worth keeping. That he'd avoided the Bayou Road entirely for nearly a year afterward, taking the long way around by boat instead, before eventually forcing himself back to using it. That he flinched every single October at the very walk he himself never missed joining Etienne on, and that everyone had always read that flinch as shared grief rather than what it actually was. Third, the moment the truth became undeniable, investigators obtained a warrant for a direct DINA sample from Guidry. Now 81 years old, still living on the same family land, still attending the same small church as the Broussards. The sample matched the profile recovered from the shirt button with a certainty the lab called conclusive. A match so specific it left no room for coincidence. When detectives arrived at his home to make the arrest, Guidry reportedly said only, in French, that he had wondered for 59 years when this day would come, before he went quietly into custody. Word moved through Pelican Bend within hours. People who had danced beside him at church fundraisers for decades sat in their kitchens that night, unable to speak. The parish that had believed harm never came from inside its own fences now had to reckon with the fact that the worst thing that had ever happened there had been walking that Bayou Road beside them the entire time, offering comfort at every anniversary for a wound he alone had caused. The community's reaction wasn't disbelief so much as a slow, sick recalibration. People quietly running back through 6 decades of small interactions with Lucien Guidry, wondering what they'd missed, wondering what else, in a parish this small, could still be hiding behind a familiar, friendly face. Guidry was charged with Camille Broussard's murder. He pled guilty rather than face trial, and in a taped statement Fontenot insisted on hearing in person, he told investigators where he had left her remains that night in 1965. A stretch of marsh less than a mile off the Bayou Road that had since become part of a protected wetland nobody had ever thought to search that far in. He was sentenced to life in prison. He was 81 years old. Camille Broussard was 19 years old. She hummed old waltzes without knowing she was doing it. She kept a piece of chalk in her purse and a pen still sitting, ink long dried, on a desk her mother could never bring herself to clear. She had a future that belonged to her by right, and Lucien Guidry took it from her on an ordinary October night in a parish that believed, with its whole heart, that nothing like that could happen there. Etienne Broussard, 89 years old by the time of the arrest, was finally able to bury his daughter's remains beside her mother's grave, 59 years after he'd last watched her walk that road. He told reporters only this, in the same French his daughter used to hum in, "I walked that road every October for 59 years. I just didn't know I was walking it beside the reason I had to." How many other small towns are still carrying a version of Lucien Guidry inside them right now? A man everyone trusts precisely because no one has ever had a reason to look closely. What does it say about justice that the thing which finally broke this case open was a piece of technology built for people looking up their family trees for fun, not for chasing down killers? And what do we owe the families who keep a dead pen on a desk for decades, refusing to let the world forget what it would rather move past? Justice came for Camille Broussard after 59 years. Her story is a reminder that truth, however late, has a way of finding the light, even when it takes a lifetime, and even when it was walking the same road beside you the entire time. If this story moved you, subscribe so you don't miss the next case we uncover, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Thank you for watching.